it is fall. It is that time where days are getting darker and things are getting creepier. We're around the time of Halloween and all of those questions. And so a few weeks ago when I was flying, I usually don't watch these kinds of movies, but for some reason I got pulled into watching a movie from that series called The Conjuring. And so I've actually never watched these movies. I kind of knew about them slightly. And so I decided to watch I think the first one on the plane. And I was pleasantly surprised. I kind of enjoyed it. I was surprised to see how uh, I would say how Christian it was, in the sense that the characters are not hostile to Christianity. They seem to suggest that they are Christians, that they believe in God. They call upon priests in order to do exorcisms. They also seem to believe that the hauntings are not actually the actual spirits, but are more of a kind of demonic, that kind of stuff. But so I was kind of pleasantly interested, and I realized that this whole Conjuring series was actually there are all these other movies that were kind of attached to it, all these other horror movies. What is it called? Annabelle and The Nun. And that these are based on true stories. They're based on the story of this couple that you see in the movie that are kind of like, you could say, supernatural detectives that go around and help people that are having these kind of hauntings or these kind of supernatural phenomena, things that happen in their life. And so, and I realized that this was related to the Amityville horror story and all of these kind of haunting stories that exist in the United States. And so I watched the movie, and I knew that it was kind of based on true stories. But one of the things I noticed in the movie, and this is really what I want to talk about, is the way in which the story was exaggerated. And so, in the movie, things get really wild, and so all kinds of crazy things happen. Women get dragged on their feet on the floor with their hair. Chairs float in the air, and beds shake, and people get bruised, and there's all of this. There's a lot of these things happen, and these visions and these creatures appear, and all of it, and it's really quite excessive. So it made me kind of curious to read the more historical accounts of some of these stories. And so I looked into the story of Annabelle, and I saw how in the story of Annabelle, they found these scribbled notes about this doll that is supposed to be possessed, and people would wake up in the morning with scratches on their hands, and there were these kind of poltergeist type activities where things would move and there would be doors opening, but obviously nowhere near the kind of craziness that you see in the movie, where things float upside down and all kinds of excessive things. And it made me meditate a little bit about why it is that when they tell the version in the movie, why they tell it the way they do. Why is it that in movies there's a kind of dramatization of events that happen in life, why that's necessary, why in some ways it is inevitable, and then also I want to help you understand how sometimes, although it is inevitable, it's important that this kind of process happens, that sometimes this can be weaponized against us.
This is Jonathan Pajot. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
In a lot of legends, when you look at the legends of Alexander the Great, you'll notice that as you read the legends, the more time goes forward, the more the legends are extraordinary, the more they are fantastical. And often people, what they like to do is they like to debunk these things. They like to say, Alexander the Great didn't fly up to the heavens with griffins in order to see the heavens. That didn't happen. Or, Alexander the Great didn't personally come up to the king of Persia, and witness him die, just, come to the scene just before he dies and hold him in his arms and and hear the story of his death, that kind of movie moment, when you read these legends, you really get these images of that are in movies, and so people like to debunk it, and which, I get it. I understand why people want to do that, but what I like to do is rather ask the question, why are we doing this to these stories? That is, why is it that these stories are becoming legendary? What is it in the story that makes it become legendary? Because nobody is making up legends, about the barbecue chicken that I cooked a few weeks ago. Like, there's no one telling fantastical stories, about my ride to the grocery store today, right? And so what is it that makes certain stories kind of accumulate legends around them? And one of them seems to be that in order for us to see the meaning of something, the deep meaning of something, sometimes you have to, in some ways, let's say, overemphasize the pattern. That is, what's going to happen is that you're going to accumulate details around the story in order to heighten the pattern. But the pattern already has to be there. In some ways, if you think about the story of Alexander the Great, who goes up into the heavens with his griffins and hears the voice of God telling him to turn back, because he's reached his limit. You could understand that this is related, of course, to the story of Alexander. That is, the story of Alexander is in some ways the story of someone who had great ambition, right? The ambition to know all things and to rule the entire world. But that at some point he could not do it. That at some point God intervened and reminded him, literally by his death, that he would not become the king of the entire world. That is not possible for a man to do so, and it is not possible for a man to peer into all the mysteries. Right? Some mysteries will hold back, and so you can see that it completely applies more to Alexander than to the guy who mows my lawn, let's say. And which would be the reason why these stories would accumulate around the legends would accumulate around these types of stories. And you can imagine that it's the same for the story of the Conjuring movies, which is that it's like, I promise you that if you had a doll in your house and you had invited a spirit to live in it, and then you would wake up in the morning and there was a little note that was scribbled, or you would wake up and the doll kept changing places and you found scratches on your arms, that you would be absolutely terrified out of your wits. Like, this would affect your life forever. But that doesn't make a movie. It doesn't make a story that people would want to tell and would people would want to remember and retell each other. And so if you make the doll, because that doll, the Annabelle doll in the actual story was like this little Raggedy Ann doll. It wasn't particularly creepy. So in the movie, they made her super creepy looking. And then, they made it, the scribbles all over the walls, and, like, it was really, really intense. And so, that is the way that you are able to get people's attention and help them see the pattern that's already there, but that in some ways is too mild in order to be retold and to be remembered, right? I remember seeing the magician David Copperfield. They asked him if he had ever seen real magic, and because he does all these performances and stuff, and if he believed in real magic. And I remember his answer was really funny. He said, yeah, I've seen real magic before. It happens. Like, there are things that aren't just in some ways illusions, that there is a capacity to, let's say, affect the world with will, and that he's seen moments of what he calls real magic, but he said it's not interesting to make a show out of. Like, I couldn't make a show out of real magic. It's just boring, I mean, it's interesting in the sense, and so his work, which is all this extrapolation and excess, is in some ways to capture, let's say, the spark of real magic, but make it into something that's a spectacle and that people will pay attention to and remember. Hello, everyone. We are finally announcing our Paradiso class. We have done 2 already. We have the Inferno, we have the Purgatory, and now we are moving to Paradise.
That is right. Dante himself says in Inferno that we prefer hell to paradise. And similarly, most of us prefer to read Inferno, but when we come to reading Paradiso, we're very confused. So we're going to be actually taking you through that poem line by line, like we did with Inferno and Purgatorio, and actually looking at how Dante very carefully reconciles some of the contradictory traditions about the heavens in the Christian apocalyptic tradition, and does that through the persons of the saints.
And so this is truly important for us right now with the re-enchantment of the world happening. We have to be able to look at those that did it in the most powerful way, that were able to reconcile the ancient pagan traditions with Christianity, with his modern understanding, the most modern understanding of the cosmos that he had. And so this is the work that we need to do, and so we need to learn from Dante. So the course starts November 5th to December 3rd, right? Is that what I've got? 5 weeks?
Right.
2 to 5 on Wednesdays.
So the cost is going to be $190 US. And if you don't want to watch live, you'll be able to follow along at your own pace, just like with all of our courses. You'll have access to lecture recordings, slides, additional readings, and you can still ask questions and interact with your fellow classmates in our circle forums.
And so join us after all of this suffering through Inferno and Purgatorio. The symbolic world finally goes to heaven.
Yeah, join us.
And so you can imagine that this applies to all kinds of stories that, especially in time, if we want to remember them, they in some ways have to snap. I kind of think about it this way. They kind of have to snap to a kind of legendary pattern, right? There are certain tropes that are easier to remember that will make the story, make you understand what's important. So if you have a sword, and that this is the sword that the king used to win the battle, then in time that sword will have magical properties. That sword will be flaming. That sword will have a will of its own that will manifest itself in the world. And what it's doing is in some ways remembering something which is true about the event. And it's not willful often. Obviously in the story of the Conjuring, it's willful. But in the story, in the way that these stories often get remembered and get told, it's often not willful. It's mostly a perception of the pattern and a desire for us to remember the importance of the story by, let's say, in the way that it accumulates this kind of legendary material. Now, what I told you is that I promised you that I would tell you how this can be used against you. And the thing is that it's used against us now all the time. And I want to give you a certain example of this, right? And so in the 1980s, there was what we call the Satanic Panic, if you remember. And so pastors in churches became very concerned with the satanic imagery that appeared in rock and roll, that appeared in popular culture. And what grew out of it was a kind of frenetic energy about notions that there were these like secret satanic cults that were everywhere in the United States, that were, kidnapping children, that were doing blood rituals, that were doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And, they didn't seem to have been able to find proof of that massive network of satanic churches that were doing all these kind of crazy stuff. And so what happened is that in some ways, the debunkers were able to debunk it. And so they debunked the Satanic Panic, and they told us, oh, this is all ridiculous, this is all nonsense, this is all conspiracy theory, and therefore all of this doesn't make any sense. You pastors, stop saying that, oh, there's all this satanic stuff. Now, the question is, was the rock and roll they were talking about satanic? And the answer is, of course it was. What the hell are you talking about? Of course the rock and roll they were talking about was satanic. Like it was using satanic tropes in order to get attention, and in order to invert morality, and in order to encourage rebellion, and in order to do all these things. It was all there in the music. Everything that is satanic was there in the satanic music, and because the extreme version that kind of appeared as a way for people to notice and as a way for people to be able to kind of trace the pattern, right, and see it in a very vivid way, that is of this giant huge conspiracy of satanic churches that exists all across the United States, and that have all of these networks and underground caves where they move children and stuff, that maybe that they couldn't find that. But it doesn't mean that the rock and roll isn't satanic. I mean, the rock and roll was obviously satanic. Right? And it was obviously inverting everything that is true and good and beautiful. And that is important. Like, that's a big deal, because satanic things aren't good for you. Satanic things, if you let's say ingest them in moments that aren't just Halloween, or like not just like in the just kind of as a kind of opposite of what it is that you should be embodying, they will lead you to your own destruction, right? And this has been the case now for several of the things that we see in culture. One of the things that people are able to do then is to point to the extreme version and make that super salient too, in terms of the enemies of the pastors that tried to say that rock and roll was satanic. They point to the super salient version, right? To the kind of huge, massive vision of these satanic churches that are taking over the US. They say that that's false. And then what they're able to do is legitimize the Satanism that's in the music. They're able to say, well, it's not that. It's just this. It's just it's just theater. It's just satanic theater, right? It's like Alice Cooper, he's just putting on a show. He's, these satanic kind of bands, Black Sabbath, all these bands, it's just it's just theater, right? And it's like, but it's satanic theater that is telling your kids to live in degenerate ways. And so you can understand, so it's like they're able to justify these things by pointing to the super salient one. And this is something that happened, nonstop, that's been happening nonstop ever since. And so, some of the crazier examples were like Pizzagate, if you remember Pizzagate, where all of a sudden people were noticing that there are all these threads that seem to point to how there were, child trafficking and pedophiles. And it grew into a massive, obviously, super salient version, again, that was similar to the Satanic Panic, where you had these like satanic elites that were engaging in all of this like crazy behavior, and then it kind of in some ways led up to Jeffrey Epstein, and the idea that Jeffrey Epstein, on his island, there was like a temple with an underground thing, and in that little temple they were sacrificing humans and were raping children and doing all this crazy thing. And so by the time someone went on the Epstein's island and they filmed that little temple, you realize that that temple was just a front. Like, there was nothing about that temple. It was like a fake temple. It was not actually even a real temple. It was like a square box with like a fake dome on it, and it had painted patterns on it. And inside there was like a grand piano, and it was like being renovated. It was just kind of a boring. And then the debunkers told us that, see, none of this is real. Like, none of this is real. It's like, oh, but there is child trafficking, and obviously there are pedophiles. And obviously there are networks of pedophiles. Those exist. We know that there are networks of pedophiles, and that there are these really important people that get caught with child pornography. There are these kind of important people that get caught with doing these kinds of things. But it's not this super crazy, satanic, like insane conspiracy, massive version of it, And so what they're able to do, which is insane if you think about it, that people are able to legitimize completely unacceptable behavior by pointing to the super salient version and debunking it, And so it's like Epstein wasn't a Mossad agent, for goodness sake. Like, there's no contract between the Mossad and Epstein that you can find that would prove that Epstein was an actual agent that was on the payroll, that was getting, bank checks and stubs with his name on it, that would show that he was, hired by the Israeli government to be an agent for them. It's like, okay. But it's like there's this whole influence part here, right? That is that yeah, of course he worked with this and this person that is related to the Mossad, and of course he had contracts with this and this person that's related to the Mossad, but he's not a Mossad agent, like James Bond, but like 007 for the Mossad. That's ridiculous. That's a complete nonsense. And what you see is that people are constantly doing this. And so now the problem, I think, for people that have wisdom, one of the things you have to be able to do is you have to be able to pull out from all of this and be able to notice that certain patterns kind of appear in culture, and we've talked about this several times in terms of conspiracy theory in general, is that conspiracy theory is usually a kind of alarm system when people start to see patterns in culture and they start to perceive that their elites are not on their side, right? That their elites they're not acting for their interests. You should pay attention to how that's happening. And even if someone is able to debunk the super salient version, you have to be able to be attentive and intelligent enough to nonetheless see that it is usually pointing to something that is real in the world, but that in order for people to pay attention, in order for people to kind of be able to circle around a certain story, it tends to move towards exaggeration, right? And it tends to kind of move towards a kind of super salient. And so, because you can think that when you're telling a story and you want to connect things together, right? Because the story ties events and people together, you will tend to want to be efficient in that story, right? So you want to make the connections clear so that people can understand the narrative, right? So people can kind of understand the narrative. And so in a story, you would in fact make a person an actual agent, and you would show them receiving orders from a shady character, in a hallway, and then that person would agree to follow the orders of the person that they receive, and therefore, that's how you tell a story. That's how you tell a James Bond story. That's how you're able to tell a story. But the thing is that in the world and in the world of events, things are a lot messier, and so the idea then in the world of everyday life that someone would have influence from a certain source and would act in accord with that influence doesn't mean that the relationship in the world has to be formal. It could actually be quite informal, but it would be a form of influence. But when you want to tell that, or you want to remember that, and especially if most people want to remember that in a way, they tend to formalize those relationships. Think about how in a movie, what you'll see, if they show a bomb in a movie, they have to show a timer on the bomb, right? Because when you're watching the movie, because you don't know what a bomb is, then in order to know that it's a bomb, you have to see a timer, right? And once you see the timer, then you know that it's a bomb. Now, when a terrorist makes a bomb, they don't put a stupid timer on it. That's ridiculous. Why would they put a timer on their bomb, like a visible timer on their bomb? That would not make any sense in the practical world. But you can understand why in a movie you want to show the timer on the bomb, because there are certain tropes that we use to recognize something quickly and know that it is real. And this is a process that happens in all kinds of ways. In a movie, what you want is the two bad guys in the two armies to ultimately meet, right? What you want is Captain America to punch Hitler, right? You want that confrontation to become simple and immediate. And so what you want is Alexander the Great to meet the King of Persia, right? And have that experience where he is there physically in the presence of the king and sees him being betrayed by his soldier and dying in front of him. That's how you remember something. You don't you don't remember things, or you don't want to tell the type of story where it's like, well, actually Alexander sent a letter to the King of Persia, and then the King of Persia answered, and then one of the intermediaries of the King of Persia, sent him this letter, and he realized that there was something going on, and whatever it is that happened, and one of his spies was there in the nation and saw what happened. however the mechanical causes, it becomes really messy and complicated. If you want to remember it and to put it in a story, if you want to put it in a movie, then you have Alexander and the king meet, right? And that's why stories are told the way they are, and that's why they're remembered the way they are. But if you want to not be manipulated, especially now in the world of narrative manipulation, you also have to be able to recognize that in the messiness of events, things don't have to snap to the pattern in that way for you to be able to see the pattern, even though when it's represented and when we retell the stories and how we remember them, it will tend to snap to that pattern, right? You'll tend to remember the bomb in your mind with a timer on it, even though that isn't necessarily what a bomb looks like when you want to cause an explosion or a terrorist event. And so now pay attention to the stories around you. If you want, maybe it'd be interesting to see in the comments if you have examples of this where in some ways we've been manipulated because of the story version, and how there is a real pattern here. The story version is the way that it's told and remembered, but people debunk the story version, and that and they legitimize they legitimize the messier version by saying, "Oh, it's not that. It's just this down here below." And so it would be fun to see examples if you can come up with them in the comments. I will look into the comments and see if you have some good ones. But this is happening all the time, folks. We are constantly being manipulated in this way. So it's useful to know that, but it's also useful to know how to tell a good story. Like if you're going to tell a story, you have to tell it in a way that is memorable, or else people aren't going to remember and aren't going to care. So I hope this was useful, guys. Thanks for your attention, and I will talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.